Hello, everybody. Welcome to the 20th edition of the FreeFuse Sessions interviews. I am Mike, the founder and CEO of the FreeFuse platform. And today, my guest is Zeina Habib. Zeina has a background in coaching, training, and project management. She has 6 years experience in coaching and training adult and youth to better navigate change, improve their communication, and build their leadership skills. She believes we can unlock a lot of our potential through self-awareness, conscious practice, and physical movement. So I'm so glad to have you here today, and really looking forward to our conversation about change and how do we actually measure it. So just want to go ahead and pass the baton over to you and to give a little background about yourself beyond what I've shared here.
Of course. So thank you so much for having me today, Mike. It's a pleasure to be talking with you. I think, as you said, I've been a coach for a while. I got certified through the International Coaching Federation here in the US. I've been working with kind of leaders and startups, scale-ups, helping them improve their leadership skills, manage change. As you know, like in the startup and scale-up world, changes every day. Like everything is changing all the time, and people are suddenly moving to becoming managers, and they have to manage down and manage up after being in such a long time in technical skills. And I've kind of like had the opportunity to work with these people through training, through coaching them, and it's been really fun and challenging to see changes and see the differences with working with different people and different organizations. That's kind of like where my background comes from. And I stretch a lot on embodiment and physical movement because I am a dancer. And I believe a lot in embodied leadership. Like everything is managed through our body. It's not just, about thinking. It's not just about talking. It's about actually practicing and starting to do those new habits that you're trying to pick up. So that's kind of a bit about me and what I do and what I'm passionate about.
Well, thank you for that background. And I believe that leadership, and coaching folks who are becoming, different roles in leadership is one of the most important things, especially as it pertains to startups, right? Because you might have been in a role where you were a specialist for a very long time, and now you're a generalist, and now you have to figure out how to manage a bunch of, people's skills and personalities and, all that goes with it. I mean, I'm in that role right now, right? And it's one of those things that I think a lot of people don't realize that they should go and actually get coaching for, right? So when you're working with a lot of these early stage folks and really trying to figure out how best to kind of work with them, how do you sort of incorporate your teachings in a way that can be accessible to them, right? Like they have so many things going on, there's so many things that they're trying to figure out. How do you make it really manageable, and how do you help them really facilitate those changes they're trying to make?
I think the first thing that comes to mind, the most important thing, is not to overwhelm yourself with change. It's like, if you are this person starting to become a manager and you're like, great, I have to start doing one-on-ones and I have to start, listening to my people and everything that they say, and I have to become this perfect manager. This is like where things become impossible and people start like going away from coaching because they're like, this is not helpful. I'm just feeling like I don't know what I'm doing. I think the first step I always say when I'm introducing coaching and when I'm working with them is take it one step at a time, one habit at a time. We can put a big goal, like we can start the first session in 2, put this big goal, put it there, break it down. But from like every 2 weeks, just focus on like little things. Like literally sometimes I am focusing on like, if you're speaking with someone, don't move your body forward, or like small things of like, just listen, just take in all the information, breathe deeper while you're talking, breathe deeper when you're listening. And it's like little changes, because this is where the big things happen. So I think this is it, like putting a big goal, thinking about it, and just like being excited to work towards it, but then working in like very small steps so that person's not feeling like, how am I going to get there with everything else I have in my life? Like focusing on 500 things plus their job is practically impossible and will make them kind of not want to do this.
Yeah, and one of the things I really appreciate about your approach, and even in your description, is how you actually incorporate the elements of physiology into the actual approach that you have, and that's what I've really appreciated. Speaking to you about this subject, And I think that a lot of people, they, it's a certain sense of identity, right? They have a certain sense of identity about how they are, how they operate. And I feel like, to be able to get change, moving in the right direction, I think there are elements of helping someone change through first changing how their physiology works, right? There's always like, if you think about the folks who deal with depression, there's a certain body posture to depression, right? And there's certain body postures to feeling proud, right? Chest puffed out and things like that. So when you started to utilize the approach of physiology to help people facilitate change, what really drew you to actually incorporating that into the executive coaching realm, right? What was it about that approach that really spoke to you, and how has it really helped add in the ability for folks to change much more easily or simply?
I mean, I'm going to use an example because it's the simplest way to go through about that. For example, a lot of people come in and they're like, I'm afraid to speak up in a meeting. Let's say that's it. And then we start working towards it. We realize, I don't know, it's a fear of being judged. Like we get to the core problem. Great, we're talking about it. What do I need to do? Push myself to do it the first time. Like go into a first meeting and just say, this time I'm going to speak up once. All of this is great. And the thinking about it is great. But what you're actually doing, the action of speaking up, the action of showing up is a physical one. I mean, you're not like thinking about it. You have to speak. And the blockage to that sometimes is physiological. Like we're thinking about it, that fear coming up, it's literally your chest closing up. It's something in your body. So if you don't learn to recognize that, breathe through it, you're not going to be able to keep going, because it doesn't matter how much you think about it. It doesn't matter. Even if you speak up, you might not show up in your best self. So to show up in your best self, you have to start recognizing, what is fear, what is shame, whatever it is, what does it look like in my body? How can I learn to identify it, breathe through it, kind of move my body around, and then do it? And like, even when you're speaking, if you have a speaking engagement, all that fear, they say, like, if you talk to a lot of the experts, like maybe moving before that a bit physiologically works through your brain, works with your hormones to kind of reduce that. So I think like we underestimate that everything that we do is an action. We're actually physically doing it. And if we don't start to realize that all of these emotions, all of these thoughts actually materialize in our bodies, then we're like kind of a step behind from making any change that we want to make.
And what's so interesting also too is like you work in with a lot of folks in tech, right? And one of the things that I feel like ends up happening when you're in highly technical fields is you kind of separate out the actual feelings of what you do with like the work that you do, because you might look at numbers all day, or you might look at code all day, and you might not realize these are a lot of the emotions that actually come up actually have a place in your body. And there was something actually really fascinating that I had learned about years ago, and I've explored since then. There's certain emotions that you feel. Joy is a certain place in your body, so for different people, and anxiety is a fear, is a part in your body, like it's the tightening in your chest, right? And people don't identify with those things, so they run rampant because they're not sure how to diffuse that, right? And I feel like a lot of being able to sort of be resilient in a sense is actually being able to notice those things in your body, and being able to sort of keep yourself afloat without like having all those things interfere with some of the more important aspects of what you do. So when you're working with the highly technical folks, how do you help them in the first stages, or if someone's trying to identify these things, how do you help them do that?
It's interesting you asked that, because it's always a challenge. Like I'll start talking with my client. They're like, what do you mean? Like, I'm just feeling anxious. Like there's thoughts in my head. I'm like, what are you feeling in your body? What's the sensation like? So I have like multiple things. So first of all, I have to push, whereas like, how is your chest like? Is it closing? Is it open? Like I have to give exact kind of like words for them to help them use them, because they don't have a vocabulary for it yet. They don't understand how it works. And sometimes I'm like pushing them. I'm like, next time you're going into a meeting, just notice what's happening. Like notice how your body is. Just start noticing that chest, those things, just kind of like pushing them to practice that. Even if I'm like, you don't have to believe in it, just practice it, because it's difficult for them to understand its importance, one. And second of all, to be able to identify it, just because they're not in tune with it. I mean, especially with people who are athletes, dancers, it's easier just because they're connected to it already. But with people who are not, such a new concept. So I'll either get them moving, I'll help with the vocab, just like push it a bit, and then I'll start using scientific terms. So how is scientifically proven that all of these things are affected by it? How is breathing going to help us? So kind of helping with those makes it more logical for them and kind of transfers that. So it's kind of like, if I have to say a few things, get them moving just to kind of like get used to being in the body, help them with vocab, give homework of just noticing what's happening in your body every day, regardless of what that looks like, and kind of trying to help give scientific background to it so that they're not thinking like, what is she talking about?
And I feel like the kind of the way that they would understand it is through the scientific background, right? Like the actual proof in the pudding, so to speak, to getting them to make that change, right? And obviously making change is one important aspect, right? Making the changes that we hope will last. But I also feel like there's the certain building of the habit, right? And building of I can recognize this, I'm continuing to recognize this is not wreaking havoc in my life, right? So when you're trying to maybe kind of install long-term changes, things that are going to be helpful for folks to kind of incorporate into their everyday life and everyday practices or whatnot, right? How do you help them sort of make that consistent effort to build that change into their life, right? Like, how do you go about saying, okay, how do we build this habit, and in what small ways could you facilitate that on an everyday basis?
So first of all, one of my favorite resources for that is Atomic Habits by James Clear. It's one of my favorite books when it comes to habit change, so I definitely recommend people reading that. So from that book and from multiple other resources, I've come down to some things. First of all, break it down to the smallest thing possible. Like break it down to like, I don't know if it's, because this is one that comes up all the time. Like I want to exercise more, like breaking down to like 20 minutes of walking, like that small of a thing. Make it like, find a cadence that would work. Don't make it too much. Don't go like, I'm gonna start walking 20 minutes 7 days. Don't go too difficult. Don't make it impossible for yourself. Set a minimum goal and a maximum. People like to be challenged, so it's like, if I do minimum of 2 times and then a minimum of 5 times, that's great. So kind of like putting that measurement for it. And I think stacking it. So making sure that it's realistic. Like, am I doing it in the morning? If someone has kids and they decide to do it at 7 a.m., that's not going to work. So what is realistic for me to do that timing wise? And just kind of, following up with them on accountability. Like, are they doing it? How's that going? Is it working? And I think the biggest thing is, if it's not happening, sometimes is that it's not working for them. I mean, I can't ask a dancer to go play basketball every day to kind of get cardio. You know what I mean? Like, they have to do something they like. That's the other thing. Like, pick something that you like. Don't pick something that you really hate. Like, if you're not into meditation, great. Let's do yoga. It's a bit of movement. It's the same concept. It gets you in your body. So let's find other ways that works for people to make it work. So if I were to summarize that, like, find what works for you. What do you love to do? Break it down into small chunks, set realistic minimum, maximum goals, and try to stack it on top of other things. Like after your coffee, they're like things that actually make sense, so that it doesn't sound overwhelming, because the bigger the action and the more scattered it is, the more difficult. So just kind of like making it, more consistent and smaller is the best way to go.
And I love that approach too. It's kind of philosophically, like with our own technology, is all about breaking stuff into the shorter bite-sized segments. But even like as we've provided guidance to folks on, through our content success, like, team, right? That we want to give them an opportunity to succeed, but you can't give them a rollout of like 6 months, for example, all in one, right? You can't just say, we're going to try and get to this point, but, we're going to do all of this work up, exactly. You kind of have to ramp people up, right? And there's a lot of stuff I've read in terms of like, behavior and the psychology around it, where it's going to be difficult to make like a large amount of change because there's like, you know, things like self-regulating units and things like that we have mentally, which like they get depleted when you try to do something completely different from what you're normally trying to do. And that's why habits don't form, because it's just, in a sense, it's almost physically painful for some people to like jump into doing something completely different, right? So you have to be able to meet them where they are and meet them in a place that's actually going to be able to, you know, be accessible to them on a consistent basis, right? I look at it from my own perspective of like, I'll try to do cardio, for example, right? And, you know, for a while I was like, I'm going to do 30 minutes of this. And then over time it waned off. I would do 30 minutes like really heavily, you know, at the beginning of the new year, right? And then I would slowly taper off. You know, you get 3 months in, I'm doing it one time a week because it's difficult to do every time. So what I ended up doing was breaking it up into 2 sessions of 10 minutes instead, right? 10 minutes in the beginning and 10 minutes in the end. And that's much more manageable than a 30-minute block where I'm just kind of sitting there and like looking at like the gym TV and stuff like that, you know, and it's almost like it feels painful to do. And you're just like, oh, well, I have to do it. Like, I really like your approach about making it enjoyable, right? Making it something that you really enjoy. And how do you fit that into your life, you know?
Yeah. And if you just said an important word, you said, I have to do it. Like the biggest work with clients is how do we transform the I have to I want to do it? Because the have to is just going to be limited. You're going to burn out after a while and not want to anymore.
Right, right. And once, you know, folks have actually made the concerted effort to make this habit, right? They've gone into this whole experience, they've opened their mind, they're ready to go, and now they're doing it, right? This is obviously more of kind of like the kind of maybe art and, you know, sort of the pseudoscience behind it. But, you know, obviously with things like losing weight, you can tangibly look at, hey, I'm losing weight by, I've gone from, you know, 160 pounds to 150 pounds in X amount of time, right? You can measure that, right? But with leadership and with like managing people, I mean, you might be able to say, well, my people hit their KPIs, but that's only but one measure, right? So when you're looking at the types of changes that you're helping people facilitate, how do you maybe help them find a way to measure that changes happen? Do you have KPIs, or is there like something that someone can say, oh, I can measurably see I've gotten better in terms of leading my team or becoming better at this particular skill?
So there's a lot of format of 360 evaluation. And for people who don't know what 360 eval is, it's basically someone doing their own self-assessment and then their reports, their peers, and then their manager assessing them. I think one of the biggest tools being used right now is 360 assessments before they start coaching, and then like it depends on the company. Some they do like, you know, at 3 months in and then like 6 months after, and they see how things change. Now, what do they measure in 360? It really depends. A lot of them base it on the big five personality, like are people being more agreeable? How are they handling their emotions? What is their work-life balance like? How are they in like the detail-oriented stuff? So it's kind of like, this is a most kind of direct measurement of it. It's like kind of like the personality traits and how is that evolving? Like, is something changing? Are people feeling like someone's becoming a bit more agreeable, or someone is becoming, you know, listens better? I think that's one. Is it, how do I feel about that? I think the problem is that you have so many tools out there, like so many 360s, and what is the one that's really working? What isn't the one that really isn't? It's a bit tricky. There are a lot of, I mean, there are ways that AI is helping right now and kind of making this a better tool. The other bigger way to manage, to kind of measure this is engagement and retention of employees. Like, how much are you able to engage your employees more and get them, you know, committed to the purpose and then wanting to stay and wanting to work and not just constantly burned out. I think that's a big one. It's like, as a manager, are the people working with me constantly wanting to stay? Is my retention rate suddenly up? But that's more of like, it doesn't measure coaching directly because there could be 1,000 other things related to it. I think this 360 is more towards the person. And here's the thing about coaching, and this is going to be a tricky part to talk about, is as a coach, you are hired sometimes by the company, but you get to a point where you're like, your client's best option might be to change jobs or like to move within the company, like move positions, because sometimes this is not where their passion lies. Like, they're here, I'm like, I have to become a better manager. And then 2 months in, they're like, I don't want reports. I just want to be a technical person. And this is what they end up doing. So how do you measure that? This is also good because that's what works better for them. This is where their strength is going to be, and this is where it's going to benefit the company and the people around them, and not, and not managing. So it is, there are tools and they're great and it works, but is it 100%, clear science? Not really. Just because you go into coaching and then there are so many unknowns that you might change, that you might relate to, that will turn your life around sometimes.
Yeah, it's kind of funny too, because it's like you were actually hired by the company to try and do this X thing, right? Like you're trying to get this person ready for a management role. And then 1 or 2 months in, they're like, nah, this isn't for me. And I think to some degree that's what they paid you for, right? Like
Yeah.
they paid you to come in and work with this person. And if they're like, I'm going to be miserable for the next 5 years of my life because I'm doing this job, I'd like to know, right? If I was being in my role, if I hired you, for example, and I have somebody like, this guy's going to be amazing. He's going to be an amazing manager. And some of that might even be the psychological safety of like, maybe that person didn't feel comfortable saying that, when you're like, this guy or gal is going to be great. They're going to lead this division to whole new heights. And they're like sitting there like, I have no idea what this guy's talking about. He should never have said any of that. I don't want to do any of that. And in even just bringing you in and saying all of, or figuring that out, I think is valuable. But then there is that added tension, right? You're now like, you're now reporting that. And of course, what probably, and I'm not on your side of the desk, right? But I imagine that probably maybe causes some level of tension, right? Like, well, you were supposed to train this person, not convince them to go to another job, or like not convince them to go to another working unit. What happened here, right? So, have you dealt with that?
Yeah, I mean, there's always tension with those things, but here's a thing, and I think especially in a startup scale up, where like when I was in the construction industry, in other industries, and the old way of thinking, people will be more like, there's more tension. But in the new way of thinking, if you care about the talent of this person, you don't want them in the wrong position, because that is going to sabotage your company. I think that's the biggest thing. Like, right now, talent retention and like working with talent, the biggest thing is having the people in the right position. It doesn't matter if it doesn't matter if like they decide to stay and I'm pushing them. If you don't ask the why, if they're not engaged, they're going to leave. They're going to leave your company. They're going to leave it worse off, because you're asking them to manage a bunch of people who are going to be burned out because that person doesn't want to manage them. And you're going to be worse off as a company. I think right now in the new world, working with scale-ups and startups, it's been better just because people understand that, and understand that the goal might shift and still get them to the same place that they want to. But yeah, I think like with more of the corporate world, it's like, that's what we need. This is the training. And honestly, I mean, I'm like, I don't want to be working like that, because my client is my first priority. And I know that and my client is my first priority, but at the same time, the company is not going to benefit if I do, like, you can't force someone to change. I mean, let's make that completely clear. I have worked with so many people for now. You can never, ever force anyone to change. No one's going to be able to maintain that. So I think it's unrealistic, and people are starting to realize that. I think that's what I love about this world, is that we're getting better at realizing that.
Yeah, having some level of human empathy to make sure that, right, like, oh, this person doesn't want to be miserable. Maybe I shouldn't make them do stuff that like is going to make them miserable for XYZ reason, right? And here's the thing. Also, I feel like with a lot of folks in the startup realm, just being in it, and myself, and like obviously talking to a lot of fellow founders, right? Like, and I feel like there's a certain level of needing to understand your team, like being able to understand like how they work properly in different roles and different scenarios. And I feel like that becomes difficult sometimes when you're like growing really fast, or you're dealing with like 100 customers, or like you have somebody who's like, hey, we were going to work on an integration, where are you with this, and things like that, right? And it obviously gets very stressful. So when you're kind of like coming in to do a lot of your change management work, or really like trying to help folks sort of scale up to that next level, right? how can you help them sort of get away from the idea of I'll conceptualize this with a sort of analogy I read from one of my favorite books, which was like Blitzscaling by Reid Hoffman and Chris, I think it's like Chris Ye or something. And they talk about putting out the fires that won't kill you, or you put out the fires that'll kill you today, but let the fires that burn like continue burning if they won't kill you for another couple of days or in a month or so. How do you kind of get some of these folks to go away from just thinking that everything needs to be solved immediately so that they can really focus on the major, highest leverage things that are going on at the company, and how that's going to reflect in the change management work that you do?
I think one of the biggest things, and like this has been so trending all over, is like, what are your values? What are you really trying to achieve? Like looking at what is that company about? What is the message it's trying to put out there? What kind of goals relate to that? And how is this action today gonna affect that goal? Like simply focusing, going back to that. And even with individual, like when someone wants to become a manager, why? How does that relate to your values, to your purpose, to your missions? Because when everything is going bad, you're like ready to do the action because you know it's going to get you to that place that you so badly want to get to. So I think that's the biggest thing, is like always focusing on what really matters. Having 2 or 3 words all the time somewhere around you where you're like, I don't know, if your value is like perseverance, or if your value is like bringing innovation, having that word somewhere where you're like, today was really bad, everything's going badly, but I want to bring innovation, and what are the actions that if I don't do will kind of sabotage that? I think that's the biggest one. And the other one on a smaller scale is I always ask my clients, is this a marble, or is this a marble, or is this rubber? You have two balls. Marble, if it falls, it's going to break. Rubber is just going to bounce back. So is this task that you have to do today, is this a marble that you need to finish today that's going to, if you don't do it, everything's going to fall apart? Is it a rubber that you can just like follow up on tomorrow? So it's more of like on the day-to-day task, but always bring back to the value, always bring back to the meaning, to the purpose, to the thing that matters, so that people remember those actions and make sure that they're doing them regardless of the urgent stuff.
I also like that approach too, because I have a similar approach of, looking at things from a daily, monthly, weekly, quarterly. I mean, everybody says they do, but it's really sometimes hard to like do, especially when you're earlier stage, right? Because you're really just looking at the day to day, like I need to survive, right? Like I need to make sure this business can still run. Like I need to make sure I can pay everybody if that's the case. And if you've obviously raised, you're trying to just grow as fast as possible and, make the case that you should, continue to obviously, get the next round of funding or whatnot, right? So I really like your approach insofar as like looking at it with rubber and marble. Right now, I'm going to think about to myself, all right, am I going to drop this on the ground? Is it going to shatter? I like that. I like that a lot, actually. So when folks are when folks are thinking about maybe some of those timeline elements, right? They're trying to figure out like what is the marble and the rubber, what is an objective that you do have to maybe work every day towards, though, to like actually get an accomplished thing done in a quarter, for example. How do you help some of these folks, like how do you help them actually achieve an understanding of timelines and different sort of zoom in and zoom out perspectives, right? Knowing that what you're going to do today will contribute to a larger payoff maybe in 3-4 months if you're doing maybe something like development or working on partnerships or things like that. How do you kind of help people keep perspectives of those different timelines of opportunities and tasks that go into the day-to-day versus something that's a little bit more long term?
I think first of all, having like the coaching sessions, because you said like it's difficult to go towards those big things when you're worried about the day to day. I think the coaching sessions, one client actually said that to me, is that space to do that. Like they're getting, like they're forcing themselves to get a time not alone with someone who's gonna push them and talk them through it. So I think the coaching session in itself is the best way to start. And then from there, the breakdown approach, like start with what do you really want? What is the big thing you want to achieve? And then break it down into those small steps that you need to do every day. Create lists, put those everywhere. Put in your house. We have a project where they have like deadline that they have on every wall. So you go in and this date is just like in your brain because every day you're just seeing it on every wall. So just kind of putting post-it notes, making lists, and just a constant reminder of the things that matter the most, because as humans, we will forget. I mean, if right now I am, super swamped in emails, I'm going to forget the things that matter unless it's there for me to look at everything and change it around, move it from one place to another so it doesn't become part of my environment. That's a big one, is that you put this reminder and it becomes part of your environment, and then you start either snoozing it or like you ignore it. So create something else, do it, put a rubber duck and attach it to the rubber duck. Then after a week, I don't know, put something else. So just kind of like constantly reviving those reminders with the words that matter to you, so that when everything's going badly, they are there. And then you have done that top-down approach. You are actually knowing what your small actions are. And I think the biggest thing is putting time and milestones to review them, because everything changes so fast. So every week, every 2 weeks, scheduling a coaching session or scheduling a session with your employees where you're like, this is only to review, are we still heading towards the same place? Or if we change, what does that look like? So I think like the big thing is, having a time aside to kind of have that kind of thinking, doing that breakdown approach so that you're on the smallest thing, and having reminders everywhere, just so that you feel constantly connected to that thing that matters so much to you that you really want to achieve, or it will fall off.
Yeah, exactly. And what's funny about the sort of, or maybe it's not funny exactly, but like I do this kind of like funny sort of thing where I actually put together the major objectives that I have, like, going on, and I like to match like what I do in a week towards those objectives, right? And it's kind of like just trying to curate the most important stuff. So like, the people can call it prioritization, people can call it whatever they want to, but I just like to have that structure so that I know whatever I'm doing is really fitting into those major objectives that I have, whether that's professional, personal, or whatnot. And then I always try to sort of fit in what I'm doing towards each of those things every week. And then I do kind of like a weekly session with myself, or working with our team to see where are we, right? Where are we moving towards? How are we looking at these sort of objectives? And if there is things that are keeping us going, falling behind, how do we course correct? How do we adjust? How do we kind of tune up or tune down depending on what we're doing in order to like reach those sorts of things? So I really appreciate that approach, right? And one of the things that I've also been very fascinated with, also with like organizations, is if the whole idea, like you had mentioned previously, about values, and the way that we need to utilize those to maybe help with some of what we're trying to explore as top line objectives. One of the things that I feel like people don't explore enough of, though, is what if you have objectives or values that change, right? Or what if you have a value that over time you realize this was not a value that I wanted to have, or maybe this value was actually not as healthy for the company to have, right? Like, for example, like, we're going to move as fast as possible. Like, maybe that's not the best value to have. Maybe some thought behind some things is going to be helpful. How do you help some of these executive folks reconcile maybe changing some of the values, or changing some of the cultural elements that maybe they stood on for so long, but now maybe they've outgrown, or maybe they just didn't work out very well?
So I think the biggest thing with those things is it create as humans, we don't like that disconnection. We don't like to feel like something that was a big part of our identity is no longer part of it. So kind of reconciling with that. And I think it's a mourning. And I it's funny using the mourning word in kind of a, you know, leadership setting, or like in a kind of a very professional setting, but it's true, because we are mourning all of that we have worked for, and that part of ourselves, that part of the company that we are losing, and just kind of being okay with that. I mean, if it makes you sad, it's okay. If there's something difficult about it, just processing those emotions, knowing that they are there, and understanding, what did we learn from it? What did we get out of it? So it doesn't feel so empty. Like, it's not wasted time. It isn't, because we wouldn't have gotten where we are if we didn't. So there's two aspects of it. Like, how do we mourn it? How do we thank it? Kind of like thank that period, that value, for what it gave us. And how do we learn from it to grow and become better people? And that sometimes, depending on the leader, takes time, because a lot of people are more attached. Like, you have people that are so attached to things. And, I'm one of them. There are a lot of things I'm attached to that it takes me time to let go of. So that period will depend on the person. Sometimes it takes 2-3 coaching sessions. Sometimes for people it's months of just learning to let go of a value, of let go of something within their company, and then replacing it with something new, with something that is better, and still honoring that, because it's difficult to say, oh, everything was wrong, I was wrong. It's more about, it's great, there was good things about it, but it's no longer helpful for me today. And kind of letting that go and just kind of starting to incorporate those new habits that we were talking about.
You know what's really interesting too is there's a actual psychological theory around things that we get really attached to, right? I mean, if some people call it sunk costs, some people call it XYZ, right? But similar to yourself, I struggle with trying to like let go of an initiative, or like say, okay, like maybe we should just like sunset this and let this pass. And I think that there's a certain level of emotional investment beyond monetary investment and time investment or effort investment, right? It's, you've put so much effort into trying to make something succeed and it didn't, and maybe you're like, okay, maybe it'll just turn around, or maybe this is the thing that we need to add to it to make it happen. And I think that there's differing levels of it, right? I think that sometimes people are a little sort of on the Armageddon side of it. Like, for example, like maybe there's a business idea for somebody that they thought was, decently working, and then they find out it doesn't work. And they decide to shut everything down rather than looking at what was the stuff that actually worked that you can actually build around, rather than saying nothing worked and just like, stopping, right? So, I think that there's, an important aspect to be reflective about it, right? And I really like what you said, more, I just need to get this out, got to mourn that and just like let it go, right? I think that is a very healthy part of it, right? Is to just say, okay, like, yes, this was a bad idea, or hey, this idea wasn't executed as well, or hey, like this was not the initiative I thought it was going to be. Let's just let it out, right? Let's just like say, okay, this didn't work out as well as it could have, but we learned from it, and now where can we go from here? So I like that approach as well, and I think that a lot more folks could really benefit from letting go of some of those things, but understanding that there is a process to letting go. It's not just let it go. Okay, go let it go. You'll be good. All right, you have a good one. It's go through this process, and you can find a much more healthy way to express that.
Yeah, and it's a tough one because no one wants to admit, like everyone wants the uncomfortable feeling to just go away. So everyone wants to like jump over that. They're like, okay, great, like let's move on. And then they start feeling themselves. There's an internal resistance where they're like doing things they shouldn't be doing. Like it just turns, this adds so much time because the denial phase, and I'm one of them. Like it's very difficult to go through this discomfort, but it just, you have to go through it either way. And the more people are likely to go through it early on, the quicker the process.
Yeah, exactly. And you hit the nail right on the head, right? It's just, there is so much about even giving yourself permission, even, right? To allow yourself to feel what you need to feel and just like work through that process, right? And people just don't like that feeling, right? They don't like to feel like they failed in any aspect, which is why I've appreciated the paradigm that's come into the experimental nature of startups, right? Like the idea of doing startups, I feel like became much more palatable when people mixed in the scientific method, because it's like, oh, every failure is a learning. It's like, rather than, oh, every failure means you suck. Like, no, that's not true, right? So I think that we all always just have to keep that whole thing in perspective of like failures can be as small and as big as you want to make them, right? Like you can make a failure about a bad marketing campaign, something where you think it tanks the company, which obviously for some people it might have if you wasted a lot of resources, right? But some people make kind of like a hill out of like a small, I forget the phrase, the mole hill out of an anthill or something like that. But
Yeah.
they make a bigger deal out of like the things that they see as like being problems, right? And somebody might have spent like $1,000 of an $11,000 like budget and been like, oh my God, what did I do? For like some kind of little campaign. Whereas like some people are like, throwing in $1 million campaign, and they're like, oh, well, we got like some people that's decently successful. So it's really all about perspective and scale, I felt like. So, either way, I think what you've outlined here has been incredibly helpful to helping people get to hopefully a place where they can be okay with the experimentation, the failure aspects, and hopefully not making too much of a big deal about it, where they feel like they're a failure and they can mourn the loss of things and move on. Um, but I know we are coming up to time here, so I did want to give you the opportunity to share anything that you'd like here in sort of like the last few moments that we have. Anything that you're, perhaps working on, that you're promoting, or even talking about what you do for executive coaches, startups, and scale ups.
Yeah, for sure. So right now, I kind of am targeting 3 different big places, new expats moving to new countries, just because right now with like all the work from, everyone's working from home from a different country, and it's kind of like part of it, there's so much change. Leaders within startups and scale ups, whether it's like the owner or like the first time leader, the second level manager, all of these people kind of working on their leadership skills, working on building good relationships upwards, downwards. How do they manage their people? How do they manage their time? And then women in leadership. I think that's a big topic that are very close to my heart, is how do you kind of go beyond that, maybe sometimes imposter syndrome? How do you push to get to the positions you want to be in? I think these are the 3 big areas that I've been kind of growing in, whether it's through facilitation of training or through one-on-one coaching. So it could be like group coaching, it could be like group training, and then moving forward with one-on-one coaching. That's kind of like how my business, and all of it is about transition through change. I think that's a big one, because all of it is about change. We're changing every day, and if we learn how to do that, if we learn how to sit with our emotions, if we learn how to grow with that, I think it's where we succeed. So I think this is kind of like where I'm at right now, and I look forward for people reaching out and being able to support more leaders, expat, and women, and kind of like the new goals that they're setting up for themselves.
Absolutely. And of course, I'll provide all of your contact information and, details, of course, on the post that we put up on all the different platforms that we'll go ahead and have this on. But, I just want to say how much I really appreciate having this conversation. Really appreciate, all of the fantastic insights. So I just want to thank you once again for coming on and sharing your unique perspectives about how folks can actually, manage their, manage change and really go through the transitions towards becoming much more effective leaders and people in the workforce.
Thank you so much for the time to speaking with me and being so interactive and kind of like making this so much fun to have. So thank you for your time too.
Absolutely. And for those at home, thank you so much for tuning in this week. We really appreciate you as always. And we look forward to seeing you again next week when we do our 21st episode of the FreeFuse sessions. Y'all have a good one.